product, the Pet Rock, introduced in 1970.
Now stretching fun farther than ever before.
We swore we'd never forget the magic of the 1970s, but somehow the most vivid pieces vanished without a trace. What did we lose when these strange, beautiful relics faded from everyday life? It is hard to explain the thrill of the first time Pong appeared on a living room television. It was just a white dot bouncing between two white paddles. But to a child in 1975, it felt like magic. There was no need for coins, no dim arcade smell, no crowd leaning over your shoulder. For the first time, you could play a real video game in your own house. That alone was revolutionary. You turned a dial, the paddle moved, and you forgot the outside world existed. It brought the arcade inside, and it was the very first glimpse of a future we now take for granted. The Atari Home Pong console was sleek and simple, a beige and black box that looked like it came from a spaceship. It was not just entertainment, it was a portal. With every bounce, you felt like you were living in the future. But more than its looks, it was the feeling. Families gathered around after dinner. Parents played with their kids. It was something you did together. That white blip bouncing back and forth was more than a game. It was a moment, a memory, and the start of everything. Today, Pong feels quaint, even silly. But in the 1970s, it was a revolution in a plastic shell. How did something so quiet and pixelated spark a worldwide obsession? Soul Train was not just a television show. It was a movement in motion, and every Saturday morning, it danced straight through your living room. It did not matter where you lived or what you had. If you turned on the television and saw that bright kaleidoscopic set and heard the beat drop, you were part of something electric. It brought soul, funk, disco, and joy into millions of homes, giving black culture the spotlight it long deserved. The fashion was wild and beautiful. The dancers were bold and free. It was not choreographed. It was felt. Soul Train lines were legendary because they turned the spotlight on the everyday person. It was joy on tape, beamed straight into a nation that often forgot how good it felt to dance. Even the silence after an episode ended felt louder somehow. Anyone with the courage to move could step forward. It gave kids in small towns the chance to see a world bigger, louder, and more alive than anything they had known. For many, it was the first time they saw themselves reflected on screen, not just as background, but as the show. Now, it is tucked away in archives, replaced by algorithm-fed clips and sterile edits. But once, it was pure. Once, it was fire. And once, it told a generation, you matter, and your rhythm belongs. What happens when the music that moved a generation fades into silence? Simon was not just a toy. It was a test of nerves and memory, disguised in flashing lights and beeping tones. The rules were simple, but the pressure was not. One wrong press and it all reset. And yet, we kept playing. In the late 1970s, the Simon electronic game became a staple in every toy aisle and nearly every household. Kids sat on shag carpets, palms sweaty, trying to remember just one more color. Red, blue, green, yellow. Repeat. Again. Faster. It was one of the few toys that made your heart race without even moving your feet. It trained your brain while tricking you into thinking you were just having fun. It turned boredom into obsession, competition into ritual. Siblings fought over turns. Friends bragged about high scores. It was not digital in the way we think of today. It was tactile, sensory, and intensely human. And the sound it made when you failed? That descending tone? It still echoes in some of our heads decades later. Simon was one of the first toys that felt like it talked to you, not in words, but in rhythm and repetition. In a way, it was training us for the future. And we had no idea. What happens when a simple game leaves a deeper mark on our memory than most of our childhood conversations? Pet rocks were the most absurd, brilliant, and completely sincere product of the 1970s. Imagine walking into a store and buying a rock. Not a toy that looked like a rock, an actual rock. And not just that, your new pet came in a box with straw bedding and a care manual. In a world spiraling through inflation, war, and cultural tension, Americans collectively decided to laugh. And they laughed by adopting a rock. The genius was not the object, but the moment. It was a wink to consumerism, a joke played perfectly straight. And yet, for some children, it became real. It was the kind of gag that somehow turned genuine, because it gave kids something stable in a world that felt anything but. For some families, it was the only pet they could afford. They named their rocks. They brought them to school. They carried them in pockets like loyal companions. Pet rocks sold by the millions. For a few dollars, you bought not just the item, but the idea that maybe life did not need to be so serious. Maybe in a world of chaos, you could still find control in something that literally never moved. They vanished as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind nothing but confused memories and collectors with original boxes. Why did something so silly feel like the most comforting purchase of the decade? Avocado green and harvest gold were not just colors, they were declarations. Open any refrigerator, oven, or blender in the 1970s, and you would find these bold, earthy hues staring back at you. They were not subtle, they were not sleek, but they were everywhere. Kitchens did not look like laboratories back then. They looked warm, lived in, human. These appliances matched the shag carpet, the dark wood paneling, the linoleum that curled in the corners. But more than their color, they represented a specific dream. A dream of the modern American family, self-sufficient, stylish, and optimistic. They made your kitchen feel alive, even when all you had was boxed cake mix and powdered milk. You were not just making dinner, you were living in a palette that promised better days. The colors came from nature, or at least someone's memory of it. They were meant to calm, to ground, to connect. Now we call them outdated. We ripped them out during remodels, but at the time, they were cutting edge. If you grew up with an avocado fridge, you can still picture it humming in the corner, stocked with soda in glass bottles and leftovers wrapped in foil. These machines outlasted their trend. Some still work. What does it say that the appliances lasted longer than the dream they were sold with? Disco Demolition Night was not just a publicity stunt, it was a riot disguised as a baseball promotion. What began as a radio gag to blow up disco records in the middle of a Chicago White Sox game turned into chaos. Thousands stormed the field, fires burned, bats were stolen, the game was forfeited. But what happened that night was deeper than music. It was the sound of backlash. A backlash against disco, yes, but also against the communities that loved it. Against change, against color, against joy. Disco represented liberation, gay clubs, black voices, women on the dance floor owning the beat. And in the summer of 1979, that scared some people. It was not just music under attack, it was people. The explosion on the field was a signal that joy had become too loud for some to tolerate. The explosion at Comiskey Park was not just about vinyl. It was about fear disguised as fun. The night left a crater, literal and cultural. Within a year, disco was pronounced dead. Radio stations changed formats. Record labels turned silent. But disco never died. It went underground. It evolved. It survived. Why do the loudest protests often come from those most afraid of the future? Stretch Armstrong looked like a superhero and felt like a bag of rubber cement. And that is why we loved him. This was not a stiff plastic action figure with a gimmick. This was a toy you could actually wrestle. Stretch his arms across the room, twist his legs into knots, tie him in a bow, and he would always bounce back. No matter what you did, he never broke. Well, unless you were one of the unlucky few who found out what was really inside, a mysterious goo that made a mess you would never forget. But that was the risk, the thrill. It felt like you had your own indestructible sidekick, part science experiment, part best friend. You were not just playing with a toy, you were testing the limits of physics in your bedroom. Stretch Armstrong was more than a toy. He was a test. Could you push him further than your friends? Could you stretch him longer than the last time? For many kids, he was the one toy that felt indestructible, like a friend who could take any hit and never complain. He lived in closets, under beds, wrapped around lampposts and table legs. Now, he lives in memories and retro collectors' shelves. Why do we remember a rubber man with such strange affection long after the elastic gave out? Polyester leisure suits were loud, shiny, and unapologetically bold. They were not just clothing, they were a state of mind. Wearing one meant you were not afraid to stand out, to sweat a little, to dance a lot. These suits shimmered under disco lights, turned heads at the roller rink, and clung to your every move. They were not comfortable, they were not breathable, but they were unforgettable. The cut was wide, the collars were wider, and the colors ranged from banana cream to burnt orange. Every department store carried them. Every television dad had one. Every uncle wore one to a wedding. They were like armor for extroverts, flashy, fearless, and fun. You were not blending in, you were making an entrance before you even opened your mouth. They were the uniform of a generation trying to find cool in chaos, and for a brief window, they were it. Today, they are costume shop punchlines, but they once made people feel slick, sharp, and modern. They were part rebellion, part performance, part polyester fantasy. Why did we ever let go of a style that dared us to be this loud on purpose? The 8-track tape was a clunky plastic miracle. It did not rewind. It did not fast forward well. It clicked in the middle of a song. And yet, we loved it. There was nothing quite like that satisfying chunk as the cartridge slid into place. You were not just playing music, you were launching something. The 8-track was freedom. You could take it in your car. You could swap them with friends. You could build a music collection that was finally portable. For kids in the 1970s, it was the sound of independence. You did not scroll, you committed. Each cartridge felt like a mixtape cast in stone. Sure, the quality was not great. The tapes jammed, the cases cracked, but holding one felt like holding the future. And in some ways it was. The 8-track taught us to curate, to choose, to chase the next sound. It vanished quickly, made obsolete by cassettes. But if you ever hear that mechanical click mid-song, your heart still remembers. Why do the formats we tossed aside leave the sharpest echoes? Shag carpeting was not just floor covering, it was a lifestyle choice. You did not walk across it, you sank into it. It came in colors no one had ever seen in nature. Burnt orange, mustard yellow, electric blue. And it stretched wall to wall, daring you to find the floor beneath. Every house in the 1970s seemed to have it, and every child seemed to lose at least one toy inside it. It muffled footsteps. It held warmth. It made every room feel like a sunken lounge. Lying down on Shag was like being hugged by the room itself. It made even silence feel plush. But Shag had a downside. It trapped dust. It collected everything. It was impossible to clean. And yet, for all that, it felt luxurious, decadent, soft under bare feet during cartoons and cereal mornings. It was carpeting with an opinion. Now we look back and laugh at it. But once, it was a dream realized in fabric form. Why did we trade comfort that bold for floors that whisper and forget? The chatter telephone by Fisher-Price was more than a toy. It was a rite of passage. Long before smartphones and screen time, toddlers dragged this smiling, wide-eyed friend behind them like a badge of growing up. It clacked as it rolled, its rotary dial spinning with every giggle and grab. Children pretended to make calls, mimicking parents with absolute seriousness, pressing plastic receivers to their ears and speaking into the world. It was not electronic. It made no real calls, but it was powerful. Because it gave kids something adults had: control, conversation, importance. It was not just play, it was practice. With every pretend conversation, a child rehearsed how to be heard. Every child who played with it was rehearsing a future where they would matter. The clicking eyes, the ringing bell, the chunky plastic body, it was built to survive anything. And most did. Decades later, many are still found in attics, dusted with time but still smiling. For a generation, the chatter telephone was the first introduction to technology, play, and imagination, long before those things were ever separate. Why does one of our earliest toys still feel more human than the phones we carry today? The hustle was not just a dance, it was a declaration that you were alive, stylish, and could move like liquid. It slid into clubs and wedding receptions alike, and if you were not doing it, you were watching it, waiting to learn. Disco brought the music, but the hustle gave it shape. It had rhythm, it had flash, and it had rules, but none too strict. It started in New York clubs, a mix of Latin footwork and soul flair, and spread like fire across the country. Couples spun and dipped with practiced ease, while groups snapped their fingers in unison, making ordinary people feel like stars. You could be shy all week and still own the room the second that beat dropped. The hustle made it okay to be dramatic, stylish, and totally unfiltered. For a while, the hustle was everywhere, on television shows, in gym class, even in living rooms, where kids tried it on shag carpeting and slid into coffee tables. The song told you to do it, and you did. Now it lives in nostalgic party playlists and throwback dance nights. But back then, it was the pulse of the weekend. The hustle taught a generation how to move together, even when the world outside felt disjointed. Why did a few steps and a catchy beat make us feel so connected, even if only for 3 minutes? CB radios were more than trucker toys. They were a direct line into an unseen world. In the 1970s, everyone wanted one. From long-haul drivers to suburban teens, the airwaves buzzed with chatter, codes, and nicknames. It was the internet before the internet, except it smelled like motor oil and lived in glove compartments. Citizens band radios turned anyone into a voice on the road, a personality on the move. You had a handle, not a name. You learned to say Breaker 19 and ask for a 1020. It was cryptic, cool, and weirdly intimate. There was magic in being anonymous, but still known. On those scratchy frequencies, your words mattered more than your face. For kids, it felt like being part of a secret club. For parents, it was safety and social life combined. The CB craze went nationwide, fueled by trucker movies, novelty songs, and a hunger for connection. People shared recipes, gave weather reports, even fell in love. And then, as suddenly as it came, it faded. Static returned, antennas came down. But ask anyone who ever had one, and they remember. The hum, the jargon, the thrill of being heard by a stranger miles away. Why did we stop talking when it was finally so easy to listen? The Pebbles and Bam Bam show felt like Saturday morning magic in Stone Age form. The Flintstones had ended, but their children were just getting started. Pebbles and Bam Bam, now teenagers, drove prehistoric cars, played in stone bands, and went to school with mammoth-powered lockers. It was silly, colorful, and weirdly modern. The show gave kids characters their own age in a world that still had dinosaurs as garbage disposals. And it worked. The voices were hip, the songs were catchy, and even though it was drawn with the same thick lines as its parent show, it somehow felt fresher. It let kids imagine a world where teenage drama and talking dinosaurs could exist side by side. It was one of the few cartoons that felt like it grew up with you. Pebbles was clever. Bam Bam was strong, but sweet. Together, they had the kind of cartoon chemistry that made kids everywhere wish their high school hallway had a saber-toothed janitor. The show did not last long, but its style stuck. Lunchboxes, records, toys, all branded with the prehistoric pair. In hindsight, it was more than a cartoon. It was a bridge between generations of television watchers passed down like a well-worn club. Why did a Stone Age sequel feel like the future of Saturday morning? Mood rings were not just accessories, they were wearable mysteries. You slipped one on, and suddenly your emotions had color. Blue for calm, green for average, black for something intense, or maybe just cold fingers. In the 1970s, mood rings exploded into popularity, sold at mall kiosks, toy stores, and head shops. They were groovy and cosmic, a mix of science and magic. For kids, they were fun. For teens, they were romantic. For adults, They were a conversation starter. It was like having a secret you could wear. Even if the science was shaky, the feelings were real. You looked down, saw a shimmer, and wondered, am I really feeling what the ring says I am? Or is the ring just feeling what I am not ready to admit? It was silly, but it was intimate. And in a time when everyone was learning to express themselves in new ways, a ring that responded to you felt like the perfect symbol. They came and went, like a trend riding a lava lamp wave. But some people never forgot the moment the ring turned violet and their heart raced a little faster. Why did a $5 trinket feel like it understood us better than we understood ourselves? Wood paneling was the heartbeat of 1970s interior design. Thick, dark slabs lined walls from floor to ceiling, turning dens and basements into cabins, even if you were 3 miles from the nearest tree. It was not about brightness. It was about mood. Homes felt earthy, lived in, safe. You could sit against it, lean back, and feel like you were somewhere older, warmer, and far from the buzzing world outside. Wood paneling was in rec rooms, behind television sets, next to ceramic owls and beanbag chairs. There was a hush to those rooms, like they swallowed noise and kept secrets. Even the creaks in the floor sounded softer next to those dark wood walls. It became the backdrop to childhoods, to birthdays, to tired parents sipping instant coffee on padded bar stools. Over time, people painted over it, ripped it down, called it outdated. But the feeling stayed, the nostalgia, the smell, that unique acoustics of a room where every wall softened the sound. It was not fancy, it was not minimalist, but it was home. Why did we trade such warmth for blank walls and cold white light? Wacky wall walkers made absolutely no sense, and that was exactly why we loved them. Shaped like little sticky octopuses, you threw them against a wall and watched them tumble down, flipping and flopping with a life of their own. No batteries, no screens, just gravity and goo. They came in cereal boxes, vending machines, and drugstore toy aisles. They were sticky, horrifyingly so. They picked up lint, crumbs, and cat hair until they looked like tiny science experiments. But the first few tumbles made everything else disappear. That weird little alien creature falling down the wall made us laugh harder than half the shows on television. But we did not care, because the first few tumbles, pure joy. Kids raced them down doors, windows, lockers, anything vertical. They became dares, contests, and ultimately sacrifices to dust bunnies. And still, we begged for more. They were cheap, they were weird, and they were everywhere for a hot, chaotic moment in toy history. What was it about a rubbery blob that made us laugh so hard we forgot the world? Sunken living rooms were part architecture, part psychology. Also called conversation pits, they lowered the floor, not just physically, but emotionally. You stepped down into them, leaving the rest of the house behind. They invited closeness. They demanded attention. You did not just walk through, you committed. Plush cushions, sculptural coffee tables, and long nights with friends curled into corners. They were glamorous, intimate, a little impractical, but unforgettable. It was a place where eye contact came naturally and no one stared at their watch. You felt more present because the space asked you to be. Cocktail parties became stories, board games became epic, and the carpet? It was the deepest you had ever felt beneath your feet. It was not just a room, it was a moment. The world outside could wait. In here, the floor dipped and the stories deepened. Why did we fill in the one space designed to bring us closer? Zany local television commercials were once the heartbeat of small-town charm. Picture this: a man in a chicken suit yelling about car insurance, a used furniture store with a jingle so catchy it still haunts your dreams. These ads were not polished. They were not focus-tested. They were raw, wild, and wonderfully weird. Every city had its own legends: the mattress guy with the mustache, the lawyer who screamed at the camera, the family-owned pizzeria that aired at 2 in the morning. There was something beautifully unhinged about them, like they were made on a dare by someone who cared too much. And maybe that is why we remember them better than half the shows they aired between. They were made on shoestring budgets and duct tape, but they had heart. And when they aired, everyone watched. Not because they were good, but because they were ours. Before social media, before viral videos, local commercials were how a community laughed together. They were real, unfiltered, sometimes unhinged, but they made us feel like we belonged somewhere. Why do we remember the jingle from that one carpet store better than half our school lessons? Crawdaddy Magazine did not just talk about music, it listened to it first. Before Rolling Stone, before glossy covers and celebrity spreads, there was Crawdaddy, raw, rebellious, and honest. It started in the mid-1960s but found its voice in the 1970s, covering rock music with a depth and seriousness no one else dared. It treated albums like literature, interviews like portraits. The writing was sharp, opinionated, and personal. It gave early space to voices that would later shape an entire industry. There was no sense of distance, just writers and readers geeking out about records like they were sacred texts. Every issue felt like a mixtape someone made just for you. It was never about trends, it was about truth. Bands that were still playing garages and grimy clubs got full-page features. Writers argued, praised, condemned, but always with passion. Crawdaddy made you feel like the music mattered because it did. And when the music changed, the magazine changed with it. Never pandering, never glossing over. Eventually, it faded, swallowed by bigger names with shinier covers. But the spirit, that raw, earnest love for sound, it never left. Why do the loudest voices in music always start with a whisper on a page no one sees at first? Beanbag chairs were not furniture. They were a rebellion against structure. In the 1970s, they showed up in bedrooms, dens, and college dorms like colorful blobs of permission. Permission to relax, to flop, to slouch without apology, made from vinyl or corduroy and filled with thousands of squeaky pellets they molded to your shape and never judged you for it. You did not sit on a beanbag chair, you sank into it. Sometimes you disappeared entirely. There was something deeply comforting about sitting in a chair that made no demands of you. It was like being hugged by furniture that did not care what posture you had. They came in bold, bizarre colors, tomato red, electric blue, harvest gold, and sat like forgotten planets in the middle of a room. Kids curled up in them to watch cartoons, teens twisted around in them while spinning records. Couples cuddled close in their sunken centers. Sure, they split open sometimes, left trails of foam beads like snowdrifts across the carpet, but they were worth it. They were fun, weird, and strangely liberating. They told you it was okay to let go for a while. Now they are considered retro, a novelty for themed rooms or ironic corners. But back then, they were the future of sitting. Why did we stop trusting our furniture to hold us the way we actually sit? The BOD Squad was not trying to be cool, but somehow it was. These were animated public service announcements that aired between Saturday morning cartoons, teaching kids about nutrition, hygiene, and healthy habits. But they did it with a beat, a groove, a jingle that stuck in your head longer than most pop songs. Characters like Yuck Mouth and Nutty Gritty made brushing your teeth and skipping junk food feel like a mission. They danced, they sang, they taught with rhythm and rhyme, not lectures. In just 30 seconds, they turned vegetables into heroes and sugar into the villain. Somehow, they made flossing feel like a superpower, and because they aired between cartoons, they became part of the ritual. You watched them in pajamas, cereal bowl in hand, halfway through an episode of Super Friends, and even if you rolled your eyes, you remembered. The message stuck. Not because of guilt, but because of joy. The BOD Squad believed in kids, believed we could learn and laugh at the same time, and for a while, we did. These tiny cartoons made a generation of children think twice about soda and skipping breakfast. Why did something so goofy and short leave such a permanent mark on how we learn to take care of ourselves? Bridget loves. Bernie was sweet, funny, and gone before it ever really got started. Premiering in 1972, the sitcom followed a young couple navigating love, family, and the challenges of an interfaith marriage. Bridget was Catholic, Bernie was Jewish, and that was enough to spark outrage. The show was a hit with audiences. It had great ratings, a catchy theme song, charming performances. It dared to be lighthearted about a topic that made many deeply uncomfortable. That alone made it revolutionary for its time. But the backlash was loud. Religious groups protested, letters poured in, and after just one season, the network pulled the plug. Not because the story failed, but because the world was not ready. Bridget Loves Bernie became a footnote in television history, a reminder that even lighthearted love stories can stir deep tensions. For the kids watching, it was just another sitcom. For the adults, it was a conversation that many did not want to have. Looking back, it feels strangely brave, a show that tried to laugh through division and got silenced for it. Why does the softest kind of progress, the one wrapped in humor, still scare people the most? Help, It's the Hair Bear Bunch was pure 1970s chaos in cartoon form. 3 bears, 1 zoo, no rules. Hair Bear, Square Bear, and Booby Bear were schemers and bell-bottoms, constantly pulling fast ones on the clueless zookeeper. They lived in a tricked-out cave with shag carpeting and invisible motorcycles. Yes, invisible motorcycles. It made no sense, and that was the point. With groovy slang, psychedelic backgrounds, and a laugh track that barely kept up, the show was like watching a Saturday morning fever dream. It was absurd, and that absurdity was its charm. In a decade already swirling with noise and color, this cartoon somehow managed to be louder. But kids loved it. It was the kind of cartoon that felt like a secret club. If you got it, you got it. It only lasted 1 season, but it burned bright. It captured the absurdity and imagination of the time, when even zoo animals wore sunglasses and plotted elaborate heists. Now it is a trivia question or a grainy YouTube clip. But once, it was a reason to wake up early, plant yourself on the carpet, and laugh at talking bears who did not care what anyone thought. Why do the strangest cartoons leave the clearest memories? Photo booth strips were not about quality. They were about the moment. 4 frames, a countdown, a flash that always came too fast. You crammed in with friends, made a face, maybe kissed someone on the cheek, then waited for the machine to hum and spit out your memory in a curling strip of black and white snapshots. There were no retakes, no filters, no do-overs, and that was the magic. They captured joy the way it actually happens. Fast, blurry, a little out of frame. They were honest in a way no selfie could ever be. You kept the blurry ones. You laughed at the awkward ones. You taped them to lockers, tucked them into wallets, slid them into journals. Each strip told a story no one else could hear. They were cheap, spontaneous, and intimate. Found in malls, boardwalks, arcades, and train stations, photo booths were time capsules with curtains. They caught you in transition, between rides, between classes, between childhood and whatever came next. Today, we take thousands of photos, but we lose them in the scroll. Back then, 1 strip of 4 pictures could say more than a whole feed. Why did we stop printing proof that joy does not need to be perfect? Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Woolco was supposed to be the next evolution of Woolworths. It had the size of a department store and the soul of a 5 and dime. Launched in the 1960s and booming into the 1970s, Woolco promised everything in one place: clothes, toys, appliances, groceries. For families used to making a dozen different stops, it felt like magic. A bright red sign that said you could get it all without going broke. But behind that promise was chaos. Poor inventory systems, outdated layouts, stores too big to manage and too cluttered to navigate. And then came the competition. Kmart, Target, Walmart, retail giants with cleaner shelves, sharper prices, and better supply chains. Woolco could not keep up. It became the store you only visited when you had to, the store where the lights buzzed too loud and the shelves were always half empty. By the 1980s, most Woolcos had either been shut down or sold off. Some were turned into malls, others just disappeared, and with them went a small piece of how we used to shop, wandering the aisles on Saturday mornings, dreaming about toys, picking out socks with Mom. Woolco was not perfect, but it was familiar, and we miss it more than we admit. Built-in intercom systems were supposed to be the future. Press a button in the kitchen, and you could talk to someone 2 rooms away. No yelling, no walking upstairs, just crystal clear communication across your house. Except, not really. These systems were clunky, ugly, and often broken. The audio quality was closer to a drive-through speaker than anything futuristic. Static, echoes, and random bursts of feedback became the norm, and when they did work, it often felt like you were eavesdropping more than talking. Even as a novelty, the intercom felt outdated within a few years, replaced by cordless phones and then home cell lines. What was once cutting-edge quickly became awkward background noise. People quickly realized that a cordless phone, or just walking down the hall, was faster and less frustrating. Within a decade, these systems went from high-end status symbols to forgotten wall boxes gathering dust. Some were hidden behind art, others were ripped out entirely. But if avocado green had a twin in tragedy, it was coming next. A color so bold, so sunny, and so divisive that it burned itself into America's kitchen memory forever. Before the sleek inline skates of the 1990s, there were the clunky, lovable roller skates with metal wheels. They strapped over your shoes with thick leather buckles and screeched across every surface like they were mad at the floor. If you skated indoors, you sounded like a marching band. If you braved the sidewalk, every crack was a threat. But none of that mattered. Because once you got going, it was freedom. You were flying, wobbling, yes, but flying. These skates had no padding, no ankle support, and no mercy. But they came with memories, rolling through driveways, circling the garage, racing your siblings until someone wiped out. You remember the sound they made on concrete, the clatter as you tried to stop, the feeling of falling and getting back up anyway. Roller discos made them iconic. Kids and teens glided under colored lights, surrounded by Bee Gees and Donna Summer, feeling cooler than they ever had. You might have never mastered the spin. You probably fell more than you want to admit. But those skates, those metal-wheeled monstrosities, were the soundtrack to a whole chapter of growing up. They were heavy, loud, and impossible to forget. There was a time when TWA meant elegance, a time when stepping onto a Trans-World Airlines flight was like entering a luxury hotel in the sky. The seats were wide, the service crisp, the logo iconic. From movie stars to newlyweds, everyone wanted to fly TWA. It was part of the golden age of air travel. But by the 1970s, the clouds were darkening. Deregulation hit hard. New competitors raced into the skies, offering faster routes and cheaper fares. Fuel prices soared, labor disputes dragged on, and TWA's once glorious reputation began to buckle. What once felt like flying with royalty now felt outdated and expensive. Suddenly, the airline of tomorrow had become yesterday's news. It expanded too quickly, bought too many jets, and could not keep up with the ruthless economics of modern air travel. Bankruptcy became a familiar word. By the time American Airlines absorbed what remained in the early 2000s, the brand was already a shadow. Airports removed the signs, crews traded uniforms, but the memory lingered. For anyone who flew TWA during its heyday, there was nothing like it. Now, it is a name buried under decades of debt and nostalgia, a ghost with wings. Sunburst clocks, brass peacocks, oversized metal sculptures of sailing ships. If it glittered and could be nailed to drywall, it was probably up there. Wall decor in the 1970s took the loudest ideas from mid-century modern and cranked them past 10. The sunburst clock especially became the crown jewel of every living room, often mounted above a fireplace or a sagging plaid couch. It was supposed to say, "Sophisticated modern family," but what it actually said was, "Time stopped in 1973." These pieces aged fast. Dust built up in the corners. The faux gold finishes dulled. And eventually, people began to question why a clock needed 20 sharp metal rays stabbing out into their personal space. Like so many things from the 70s, it was a style built on boldness. And boldness is a hard thing to live with, especially when it came in shades of burnt orange and baby poop brown. Leisure World was not just a retirement community, it was a promise, a dream built on sunshine, shuffleboard, and stress-free living. Born in the 1970s, Leisure World offered gated bliss for seniors, condos, golf carts, social clubs, and security. It was pitched as paradise for the golden years. But paradise costs money. And by the 1980s, cracks started to show. Economic downturns hit retirement savings hard. Fixed incomes did not match rising maintenance fees. And some residents found that the dream came with hidden rules, strict covenants, and unexpected costs. The promise of simplicity turned into a maze of fine print. For many residents, retirement began to feel like a contract they never meant to sign. Lawsuits followed, disputes over control, access, and promises made but not kept. What began as a utopia turned, in many places, into something colder. Today, some Leisure World communities still exist, but the shine is gone. The brochures have aged. The palm trees are the same, but the illusion has faded. For many, it is still home. But for others, it was a broken promise wrapped in sunshine. A reminder that even dreams built in good faith can crack under real pressure. In the 1970s, getting a TV signal felt like summoning the spirits. You did not just turn on the television and sit back, you had to work for it. That meant rabbit ears. That meant stretching, adjusting, and holding metal rods in every direction. And when the fuzz would not go away, there was only one solution: tin foil. It crinkled, it sparkled, and somehow it worked. Wrapped like a desperate science experiment, your television antenna became a sculpture of hope and frustration. You might remember your sibling being the designated antenna holder, standing on one leg, arm raised, frozen in place while the rest of the family watched. It was trial and error, comedy, and chaos. The goal? A clear picture, even if it only lasted 5 minutes. There were always threats not to move, begging someone not to breathe too hard, cheering when the static cleared, booing when it came back. It was not just about the picture, it was about the ritual, the teamwork, the sacrifice. You learned patience, you learned creativity. You learned that a ball of tinfoil could mean the difference between watching your favorite show or sitting in silence. It was frustrating, ridiculous, and completely unforgettable. In the 1970s, you could walk into any living room and find a macrame plant hanger swaying near the window. Handmade from twisted cords, thick yarn, or even old rope, these hangers were more than decoration. They were statements. Your mom or aunt probably made one at a craft night or picked one up at a flea market. They cradled ferns, spider plants, and anything green, sometimes hanging over orange shag carpeting or wood-paneled walls. Some had beads woven into the strands. Others had patterns that seemed to hypnotize you if you stared too long. They were often hung with a brass hook screwed right into the ceiling, dangerously close to ceiling fans or light fixtures. But no one cared. It was groovy. It was artistic. It was freedom and nature brought indoors. The macrame craze represented a return to earthiness and personal touch. You were not just buying a product, you were tying every knot yourself. And if you were not making one, someone you knew definitely was. These hangers aged, gathered dust, sometimes sagged under too much weight. But they were beloved. They matched the houseplants perfectly and brought warmth into every room. Seeing one today might feel like stepping into your grandmother's sunroom on a quiet afternoon, the scent of potting soil and lemon-scented furniture polish in the air. Burger Chef once had more locations than McDonald's. That is the part people forget. Before the Golden Arches took over every highway exit and downtown corner, Burger Chef was America's fast food sweetheart. Its secret? The Fun Meal, a direct precursor to the Happy Meal. It gave kids toys, games, and branded packaging years before anyone else did. The burgers were solid, the prices were right, and families loved it. But then came the lawsuits, the missteps, the slow bleed of bad business decisions. Hardee's bought them out, closed down locations, and erased the name almost overnight. Some buildings stayed standing for years, sun-faded signs above cracked pavement. You would drive past them and remember the taste, the toy, the tray that made you feel like the meal was yours. What happened to Burger Chef was not just corporate takeover, it was theft by attrition, a slow-motion forgetting of something that once mattered. Ask anyone over 50 if they remember it, and their eyes light up. But there are no new stories being made. No drive-thrus, no jingles, no future, just memories. And that, for a brand that once brought so much joy, feels like a tragedy no one saw coming. Orange and brown. Together, they were supposed to represent warmth, nature, and the grounded spirit of the 1970s. Designers called them earth tones. Homeowners called them modern. But within a few years, most people started calling them ugly. These colors crept into every corner of the house, from rust-colored curtains and burnt orange sofas to chocolate-brown carpets and gold-tinted kitchenware. When paired with low lighting and wood paneling, the effect was not soothing, it was stifling. Rooms felt smaller, homes felt older. The optimism of the post-war era was gone, and in its place came heavy, saturated tones that weighed everything down. It was like living inside a forever sunset that never let up. Even kids' bedrooms, meant to be bright and fun, often ended up looking like burnt orange caves. By the time the 1980s rolled around, decorators ran screaming toward pastels, neon, and glass. Orange and brown were buried under coats of white paint and forgotten, like the dusty shag carpets they often matched. But style was not the only thing people gave up on. Sometimes, even the furniture itself just gave out. Before it made video game history, Coleco was just trying to survive. The Connecticut Leather Company, yes, that is what Coleco stood for, started with shoes and evolved into above-ground pools, plastic toys, and electronic gadgets. In the 1970s, it was everywhere, but it was never dominant, always chasing trends. Then came the video game boom. ColecoVision arrived and gave the company its first real taste of national success. The graphics were better, the games felt fresh. For a brief moment in the early 1980s, Coleco looked unstoppable. It felt like they had finally found their niche, a lane where they could lead instead of follow. But success came faster than the company could stabilize, but it did not last. The video game crash of 1983 hit like a hammer. Coleco overextended, banking on a market that evaporated almost overnight. It tried to pivot again, launching the Cabbage Patch Kids dolls, which sold in the millions. But lightning rarely strikes twice. Manufacturing problems, patent lawsuits, financial strain. By the end of the decade, Coleco was bankrupt, sold off, dismantled, and the dreams of a plastic empire turned to dust. For anyone who grew up in that era, Coleco was part of the magic, part of the joy, part of the fall. The Viewmaster was not just a toy, it was a portal. You held it up to your face like binoculars, clicked the lever, and entered a new world, one tiny slide at a time. These were not just pictures. They were 3D windows into places you had never been and shows you loved. Suddenly, Bugs Bunny was popping out at you. You were walking through Disneyland or swimming under the sea. The images were bright, bold, and vivid, especially when the sunlight hit just right. The reels came in paper packets, labeled like treasure maps, each one promising a new adventure, and you kept them all, in shoeboxes, in drawers, maybe scattered across the floor until your mom made you pick them up. The Viewmaster made you feel like a traveler, even if you never left your room. It was quiet entertainment. No batteries, no wires, no screens. Just your imagination and a satisfying click with every slide. The joy was in the anticipation. What will the next picture be? Where will I go next? You could spend hours lost in it. You remember how your arms got tired, but you kept clicking. One more reel. One more journey. Because for those few minutes, the world was just you and the magic inside that plastic viewer. Datsun was everywhere in the 1970s. Sleek, reliable, affordable. The kind of car your neighbor drove, your cousin saved up for, and your dad secretly liked better than his American sedan. It was Japan's Trojan horse into the United States market, and it worked brilliantly. But success brought identity problems. Nissan, its parent company, wanted global consistency. They did not want to be Datsun in one country and Nissan in another. So in the early 1980s, the decision was made: rebrand. Slowly, Datsun vanished. The name was pulled from brochures, badges, and showrooms. And just like that, a brand that millions had trusted was gone. People were confused. Dealerships had to explain that Nissan and Datsun were the same. Some buyers walked away. The transition was rocky, and for a while, Nissan lost ground in the market it had fought so hard to win. Looking back, the choice makes sense. But it still feels like something was stolen. A name, a memory, a piece of the road. The kitchen was the heart of the 1970s home, and avocado green was its crown jewel. At least, that is what the designers claimed. Appliances from toasters to refrigerators were coated in this earthy green, a color meant to feel natural and calming. But instead of evoking gardens and freshness, it often made kitchens feel dim, claustrophobic, and permanently stuck in the past. Imagine walking into a kitchen where every appliance matches the color of an overripe avocado. At the time, it felt sleek, stylish. But once that color started to fade, or clash with updated counters and cabinets, it became painfully clear that avocado green was never going to age gracefully. What once felt trendy now felt like a permanent bad decision baked into your kitchen. As tastes shifted toward lighter, brighter spaces, avocado green quickly became a design cliché. By the time the 1980s rolled in with its love for chrome and white laminate, avocado green kitchens became the punchline to a joke about bad design choices. Today, they serve as a visual reminder that what is trendy now might become embarrassing later. But green was not the only color we overcommitted to. There was another hue that infiltrated every home and overstayed its welcome, especially underfoot. Braniff International Airways was not just an airline. It was a fashion show in the sky, a flying work of art with orange planes, purple interiors, and flight attendants dressed by Halston. It was the kind of thing only the 1970s could dream up, and only the 1970s could destroy. It started with color and glamour. People felt like royalty walking onto a Braniff jet, but underneath the paint and press photos was a brutal truth. The airline industry was changing. Gas prices were soaring. Deregulation was coming. Braniff spent money like it was printing it, buying more jets, building grander lounges, and betting big on routes it could not afford. When the economy crashed and fuel costs doubled, Braniff found itself choking on luxury. Passengers stopped flying for style. They wanted cheap. They wanted direct. They wanted reliable. Braniff had become a symbol of excess in a decade no longer willing to pay for it. By the time it folded in 1982, people barely blinked. The planes were grounded, the bright colors faded, and the dream of glamorous air travel took one final nosedive. Ask anyone who flew Braniff in its prime. They will smile, maybe even tear up. Then they will tell you it never stood a chance. If you remember Clacker Toys, you probably also remember getting smacked in the face. These were two solid acrylic balls connected by a string, meant to be swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. That was the whole toy. No batteries, no screen. Just two hard spheres ready to leave a bruise. And kids loved them. The louder and faster they clacked, the cooler you were. It was a skill to master. Get the rhythm right, and you could keep them going for minutes. Get it wrong, and you got a nasty surprise. Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Hospitals probably kept a few on hand just to demonstrate what not to do. They were loud, dangerous, and oddly satisfying. For a few wild years, clackers were everywhere, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and hidden under beds when they got taken away. Eventually, safety concerns shut them down, but not before a generation got their fill of noise and near misses. They were outlawed in some places, but that only made them cooler. If you ever got them moving just right, you remember the thrill, and maybe a headache to go with it. They were chaos in toy form, and we would not have had it any other way. Wood paneling was everywhere in the 1970s. It made your living room look like a den, your den look like a hunting lodge, and your basement looked like a forgotten back room at a roadside bar. At first, it felt warm and cozy. Rich brown tones, faux wood grain, maybe even a little glossy finish if you were lucky. But there was a problem. Most of it was not real wood. It was thin, pressed panels with a printed veneer. It dented easily, warped when damp, and turned rooms into narrow, lightless boxes. The illusion of natural wood faded fast when corners started peeling and warping with moisture. What was meant to bring a rustic touch ended up feeling cheap and oppressive. Once a sign of stylish Americana, it aged into a symbol of dated taste. The worst part? You could not just paint over it. People spent entire weekends trying to rip the stuff down or cover it with drywall. Today, retro renovators might leave a single accent wall for nostalgia, but most of us remember wood paneling for what it truly was: fake, dark, and way too committed to its own aesthetic. And when the walls started closing in, families turned to high-tech solutions to feel connected inside the home. Unfortunately, those did not age much better. Pan American World Airways was not just a brand. It was a symbol, a ticket to the world stamped in blue and white, with flight attendants in crisp uniforms and ads that made the world seem smaller and more elegant. For much of the 20th century, flying Pan Am meant you had made it. But by the 1970s, the cracks were showing. Oil prices spiked, air travel deregulated, competition exploded, and Pan Am, bloated with international routes and expensive aircraft, could not adapt fast enough. It tried new services, rebranded its cabins, and even launched a short-lived domestic push. But nothing stuck. The glory days were gone, and the bills kept coming. By the early 1990s, it was over. Planes grounded, staff laid off, logos fading from airports and travel posters. For many Americans, Pan Am was their first flight, their first window seat, their first glimpse of the clouds from above. To watch it fall felt like watching the future turn to dust. It was more than a business loss. It was a goodbye to the golden age of travel. Mood rings promised to read your soul. Slip one on, and suddenly your finger was a window into your emotions. Or so we thought. The magic came from a tiny, color-changing stone set into a thick metal or plastic band. It shifted hues depending on temperature, but as kids, we believed it told the truth. If it turned blue, you were calm. If it went black, you were angry. Green? Maybe in love. We studied those little charts that came with the ring like they were sacred scrolls. Every recess and sleepover had at least one person interpreting moods. Sure, the science was sketchy, and sure, it mostly just reflected how cold or hot your hands were, but to us, it was real magic. It felt like the ring knew something we did not. Every kid had one, lost one, or begged their parents to buy one from a gas station or gift shop. The band turned your finger green eventually, but you wore it anyway. It was a talisman, a tiny crystal mood detector that let you feel seen, even if it was just a gimmick. To this day, nothing quite compares to the mystery and wonder packed into one shimmering, shifting little stone. Plymouth was never the flashiest name on the road, but it was trusted, reliable, American. It was the car your uncle fixed up in the driveway, the station wagon that took families to the Grand Canyon, the compact that young drivers learned to parallel park with. In the 1970s, Plymouth had already seen better days, but there was still hope. Then the market shifted. Gas prices spiked, Japanese imports hit harder and faster than anyone expected, and Plymouth's offerings started to feel outdated. Chrysler focused its attention elsewhere. Dodge got the performance, Chrysler got the luxury, and Plymouth got what was left. People still bought them, but it felt like settling. You were not proud to drive a Plymouth. You were just glad it still ran. Sales dipped. Innovation stalled. Even iconic models like the Duster could not save the brand. The writing was on the wall. By the 1990s, Plymouth was a forgotten middle child, unloved and unnecessary. In 2001, Chrysler officially pulled the plug. For decades, Plymouth had been a quiet part of the American story. And now, it is a footnote. But the memories remain, in faded photos, old commercials, and the sound of an engine that will not come back. If one of these treasures stirred a memory, drop your favorite in the comments, give us a like, and subscribe for more forgotten gems.